A young boy from a struggling neighborhood helps a war veteran in need, expecting nothing in return. But the next morning, a sleek black limousine pulls up to his house, and his life is about to change forever. What secret is about to be revealed? And how will one small act of kindness spark a chain of events that could alter everything he's ever known? Prepare yourself for a heartwarming, jaw-dropping journey of growth, challenges, and unexpected twists. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our exciting updates in the future. Isaac Green's life was far from easy. His family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Jackson, Mississippi, a small town where the grind of daily life often overshadowed dreams. The streets were lined with houses that had seen better days, peeling paint, rusting mailboxes, and yards in desperate need of care. Yet in this quiet neighborhood, Isaac found his sense of purpose and determination. Isaac was 12 years old, but he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. His mother, Clara, worked tirelessly as a janitor at the local middle school. Her job, though steady, didn't bring in much, and every evening she would come home exhausted, still trying to make ends meet. Isaac's father, a war veteran, had died when Isaac was just a baby, leaving Clara to raise him and his younger sister Emma alone. Isaac had heard stories of his father's bravery, but the man had become nothing more than a shadow in the stories Clara told him when he asked. Isaac often thought of his father. He wished he could have known him, wished he could have learned about courage, duty, and sacrifice firsthand. But all Isaac had were memories filtered through the eyes of a woman who had loved him deeply and missed him even more. In a way, Isaac felt responsible for both his mother and his sister. He wasn't old enough to take on the world, but he wanted to. Every time he saw his mother's tired eyes or heard Emma's laughter despite the struggles, he was reminded of his role in the family, to protect them, to help them, to keep them from falling. As Isaac walked home from school, the weight of the world felt especially heavy. His sneakers, patched with duct tape, scraped against the cracked pavement, making each step feel like a reminder of the life he had yet to escape. He had mastered the art of staying invisible at school. The taunts of Kyle Benson, the school bully, still echoed in his mind, but Isaac didn't let them show. He knew if he could keep his head down, avoid confrontation, he'd get through the day, but it was never easy. "You're a nobody, Green." Kyle's words haunted him. They were nothing new, just the same old insults. Yet they cut deeper every day, reminding Isaac of his family's poverty, his own lack of status, and his fear of failure. It made his world feel smaller. The neighborhood was quiet as he turned the corner toward the diner at the edge of town. Isaac's eyes scanned the streets, his thoughts filled with the usual worries. How to help his mother with the bills, how to protect Emma from the harsh world outside. But something caught his attention. An elderly man sat in a wheelchair, struggling to get up the steep ramp leading into the diner. Isaac recognized him immediately. It was Hank Mitchell, a local war veteran who lived nearby. Hank wasn't a frequent visitor to Isaac's school, but everyone knew him. The old man was a regular at the diner, and though people respected him, they rarely stopped to help. Hank's hands trembled as he gripped the wheels of his chair, trying but failing to make any headway up the ramp. His face was etched with frustration. Isaac paused for a moment, then, without thinking twice, jogged over. "Sir, let me help you," Isaac said, placing his hands on the handles of Hank's wheelchair. Hank looked up, startled. For a moment, their eyes locked. The old man's weathered face softened into a smile. His eyes, though tired, sparkled with gratitude. "Thanks, kid. These ramps aren't as easy as they look," Hank grunted, though his voice was laced with appreciation. Isaac didn't say anything. He simply pushed, determined. The wheels of Hank's chair slipped and slid over the worn concrete, but Isaac kept his footing, careful to keep the man from falling back. With steady effort, they made it to the top of the ramp, and Hank rested his hands on his knees, catching his breath. "You're a good boy," Hank said, his voice rough but sincere. "Not many would have stopped to help me." Isaac shrugged, trying to downplay the compliment. "It's nothing. You needed help, that's all." For a moment, Hank studied Isaac with his piercing blue eyes. He seemed to be searching for something in Isaac's quiet demeanor. Finally, he nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that mean the most, he said, his words hanging in the air. Isaac smiled faintly, then turned to leave, his heart swelling with a strange sense of pride. There was something about Hank's gratitude that filled him with warmth, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he had done something good. He had made a difference, even if just for a few moments. As Isaac walked back toward his house, the familiar streets of his neighborhood looked different. He felt lighter. The thoughts of school and the bullies faded, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, something better. Back at home, the screen door creaked open as Isaac stepped inside. The familiar scent of something cooking greeted him. "Is that you, Isaac?" Clara's voice called from the kitchen. Isaac smiled, shaking off the lingering weight of the day. He was home, and for the first time in a while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. "Yeah, it's me, Ma." As he dropped his backpack by the door, he could hear the sound of crayons and paper. Isaac turned to see Emma sitting on the floor, a pile of drawings scattered around her. She looked up with a big smile and held up a picture. "Look, Isaac, it's you," Emma said proudly, holding up a crude drawing of a superhero with a cape. Isaac smiled, kneeling down to inspect it. "You think I'm a superhero?" Isaac asked, ruffling her hair gently. Emma beamed. "You're my hero, Isaac." Isaac's heart ached with love for his sister. He didn't feel like a hero, not at all. Heroes didn't watch their moms struggle to pay the bills. Heroes didn't have to dodge the cruel taunts of kids like Kyle. But in Emma's eyes, he was. And for a fleeting moment, he wanted to believe it. As Isaac lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the words Hank had spoken echoed in his mind. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that mean the most. The simplicity of that statement felt like a revelation. Maybe it didn't take grand gestures to make a difference. Maybe helping others, no matter how small, was enough. But for Isaac, there was still something more. A yearning. A need for something greater than what his life had given him so far. Could one small act really change everything? The night felt quiet, but Isaac knew that the next day, like every other, held the potential for change. Perhaps it was time for him to take a step towards something bigger than just getting by. Maybe the universe had a way of delivering unexpected chances. And just maybe, he was ready for it. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Isaac woke up the next morning, but the world outside already seemed different. His feet hit the floor with the usual heaviness, but something felt lighter inside him. The small, seemingly insignificant moment of helping Hank yesterday was still fresh in his mind. The words Hank had said, "Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that mean the most," clung to Isaac like a promise he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Isaac shuffled through his morning routine, thoughts swirling. As he walked the same cracked sidewalks to school, his steps felt different, lighter. Maybe it was the sense that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't invisible. Maybe it was the realization that kindness could be his power. But what Isaac didn't know was that today, this ordinary morning, wasn't going to be ordinary at all. When Isaac arrived home that afternoon, his thoughts were occupied with the usual worries. The way Kyle Benson had looked at him in the hallway earlier that day made Isaac's stomach churn. He hadn't said anything, just a sneer. But the message was clear. Isaac didn't belong here. Not in this school. Not in the world that Kyle lived in. Isaac was about to let those thoughts consume him when something else caught his attention. A sleek black limousine was parked outside their house. Isaac stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the polished vehicle as his heart rate picked up. Limousines didn't come to his neighborhood, not ever. His first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe someone had parked it in the wrong place. But as he looked closer, he noticed two figures standing near the car. One of them was unmistakably Hank Mitchell. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. What was Hank doing here, and why in a limousine? Confusion clouded his thoughts as he walked slowly toward the house. His mind raced. Was Hank in trouble? Had something happened? Why would he need such luxury? As Isaac stepped closer to the front porch, Hank looked up and smiled, his usual weathered face now holding an expression of unexpected warmth and satisfaction. "Isaac," Hank called out, his voice carrying easily across the street. Isaac froze, his heart skipping a beat. Hank had never called out to him before. Not like this. He looked at Hank, who was now standing beside a tall man in a sharp navy suit, his silver hair gleaming under the afternoon sun. The man gave Isaac a polite nod as he extended his hand. "Isaac Green," the man said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I'm Edward Lockwood, a friend of Mr. Mitchell here." Isaac stood frozen, his mind spinning. Edward Lockwood. He had no idea who this man was, but the suit, the car, it screamed of wealth and power. He glanced at Hank, but Hank merely smiled, a look in his eyes that seemed to say, "Trust me." "Edward Lockwood," Isaac repeated slowly, unsure of what else to say. His hand was cold and sweaty as he shook the stranger's hand, still trying to process the surrealness of it all. Why was this man here? And why had Hank brought him to Isaac's house? "You must be Isaac's family," Edward said, turning toward the door. "May we come in? I'd like to have a conversation with your mother." Isaac's mind raced. Was this some kind of mistake? The man seemed genuine, yet everything about this situation felt strange, foreign. The warmth of Hank's smile offered him a small sense of reassurance. But that reassurance was short-lived when Isaac heard the sound of the screen door creaking open behind him. Clara stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, looking confused and slightly taken aback. "Isaac, who?" she started, but then she saw Edward standing there with Hank. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Edward said with an air of polite authority, his tone warm but unwavering. "I'm Edward Lockwood, and this is Mr. Mitchell. I wanted to speak with you about your son." Clara stood frozen for a moment, clearly unsettled. She glanced back at Isaac, who was equally perplexed. Isaac couldn't remember the last time anyone from outside their neighborhood had come to visit. The whole thing felt wrong. Too good to be true. "Is everything all right?" Clara finally asked, her voice laced with caution. She wasn't used to visitors, especially not ones in expensive suits and limousines. Edward smiled politely, though his expression was full of intent. "I have an offer for your son, Mrs. Green," he began, his words deliberate, as though he had rehearsed them for this very moment. "Mr. Mitchell and I have been talking, and we've been very impressed with Isaac's character. I would like to extend an opportunity to him." Clara's expression softened slightly, but suspicion remained in her eyes. "Opportunity," she repeated, her voice guarded. "Yes," Edward replied. "A scholarship for Isaac to attend a prep school, a place where he can develop his potential, academically and personally. We believe he has what it takes to succeed." Isaac stood in the background, overwhelmed by the suddenness of the conversation. His thoughts swirled. A prep school? A scholarship? It all sounded like a dream, something out of reach, something impossible for someone like him. "I don't understand," Clara said, looking at Edward and then back at Isaac. Her protective instincts flared. "Why my son? What's the catch?" Edward's smile remained calm. "There is no catch, ma'am, only an opportunity. Mr. Mitchell and I have seen potential in Isaac, true potential. We want to give him the chance to fulfill that potential." Isaac felt his heart race. This wasn't just a conversation about school. This was about a whole new life, a life he'd only ever dreamed of. But then doubts crept in. Was this real? Why him? Why now? "I'll leave the decision to Isaac," Edward continued, "but I do believe he's someone special. This is a chance for him to build the future he deserves." Clara looked at Isaac, her face filled with confusion and hesitation. She opened her mouth to speak, but Isaac cut her off. I don't know, Ma. This feels like something too big for us," Isaac murmured, his voice wavering. The weight of the decision already felt like it was too much. "Take your time," Edward said gently. "This isn't an easy decision, but you won't have to make it alone. We're here to help." Isaac's mind was spinning. He wanted to believe in this opportunity, to see a way out of the struggles that had plagued his family for years. But fear gripped him tightly. Could he really leave everything behind? The conversation with Edward Lockwood had left Isaac feeling more uncertain than ever. The offer was undeniable, but it also felt like an unspoken weight pressing down on him. A scholarship to a prestigious prep school was a dream, one Isaac never thought could be his. Yet the dream came with a burden, one he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. That night, Isaac lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. His thoughts spun around the idea of leaving behind his home, his family, everything familiar for a life that felt so far removed from the one he knew. The words of Hank Mitchell echoed in his mind, reminding him of the opportunity to change his life. But change, Isaac realized, could be terrifying. Was he strong enough to step into a world he didn't belong to? Was he ready to leave his mother and sister behind in the struggle they had known all their lives? The next morning, Isaac walked to school, trying to push away the doubts that clouded his mind. But as he passed the corner of the block where he'd often seen the other kids gather, the familiar sting of Kyle Benson's taunts hit him like a blow to the chest. "Dream all you want, Green, but you'll never be anything." Isaac clenched his fists, pushing the words out of his head. He had heard them all before, but they always cut deeper when he felt unsure of himself. The heaviness of those words seemed to follow him all the way to school, and by the time he reached his locker, his stomach was in knots. Isaac's school day was long, the halls full of whispers, the laughter of the kids who thought he was less than them. At lunch he sat alone, avoiding the group of boys who usually made fun of him. Kyle and his friends would often sneer at Isaac from across the room, but it wasn't their words that bothered him today. It was the silence of his own thoughts. What if they were right? What if he wasn't good enough? When Isaac got home, the tension in his chest only grew. His mom, Clara, was at the stove working on dinner. The usual smell of pasta and tomato sauce filled the kitchen, but Isaac couldn't focus on the comforting scent. He felt distant, as if he were no longer a part of the small world that had always anchored him. "Isaac?" Clara's voice cut through his thoughts. "Dinner's almost ready." Isaac nodded but didn't answer. He dropped his backpack by the door and walked toward the kitchen table. Emma was already sitting there, her crayons scattered across the surface, working on yet another drawing. When she noticed Isaac, she looked up with a big smile and held up her picture. "Isaac, look, it's you, just like a superhero," she said proudly, her wide eyes gleaming with admiration. Isaac forced a smile, crouching down to look at the drawing. The figure on the paper was a crude but colorful depiction of him in a cape, standing tall and proud. "You think I'm a superhero, huh?" Isaac asked, ruffling her hair gently. "You are. You're my superhero, Isaac," Emma said with complete confidence, her small hands clutching the drawing like it was the most important thing in the world. Isaac stared at the drawing for a long moment. His heart swelled with affection for his little sister, but the warmth quickly gave way to the weight of guilt. Heroes didn't have to watch their mother struggle to make ends meet. Heroes didn't dodge the cruel comments of their peers. Heroes didn't feel so small in a world that constantly reminded them they didn't belong. After dinner, Isaac retreated to his bedroom, lying on his bed staring at the cracked ceiling. The sound of the TV drifting in from the living room barely reached him. He could hear his mother talking to Emma, her voice soft and comforting. It reminded Isaac of everything she had done for him, and of how much she had sacrificed to make sure he and Emma had the life they did. She had worked tirelessly, kept their home together despite the weight of bills, of uncertainty. And Isaac couldn't help but feel he wasn't enough, wasn't strong enough to take on all of it. Could he really leave her behind? Could he pursue a dream at the cost of what he knew would be even harder for her? Was it selfish to think about his future when his mother was struggling to even get through today? Isaac rolled over and stared out of his window at the stars. They seemed so far away, just like the life Edward was offering him, a new world that seemed so out of reach. He wasn't even sure he could be the person Edward saw in him. The next morning, Isaac decided to clear his mind. He left the house early, before the sun fully rose. The streets of Jackson, still quiet and covered in early morning fog, seemed like they were offering him some sense of peace. As he walked past the diner, he saw Hank Mitchell sitting outside, his usual spot by the window with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Hank waved at Isaac, a welcoming gesture that made Isaac's heart skip a beat. "Morning, kid." Isaac hesitated, then walked over and sat across from Hank. The old veteran looked up at him, his weathered face softening as he studied Isaac. "You all right?" Hank asked gently, noticing the unease in Isaac's eyes. Isaac sighed deeply. "I don't know, Hank. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I don't know if I belong there at the prep school." Hank leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. I didn't think I had what it took either. But you know what got me through, kid?" Isaac shook his head, looking at Hank, waiting for the answer. "It was the people around me," Hank continued, his voice slow and steady. "They believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And eventually I started to believe in myself too. You got more in you than you realize, but you gotta trust it." Isaac felt something shift inside him. The uncertainty didn't completely disappear, but Hank's words struck a chord deep within him. Self-doubt had been his constant companion, but maybe it was time to trust in something more. Maybe it was time to take that leap. "Thanks, Hank. I needed to hear that." The older man smiled, giving Isaac a nod of approval. "Don't mention it, kid. You're tougher than you think." As Isaac stood to leave, he felt lighter, the weight on his shoulders not quite as heavy as it had been the day before. The burden of dreams was still there, but for the first time, he felt ready to carry it. Isaac had always imagined that getting accepted into a prestigious school would feel like a victory. But standing at the gates of Stanton Prep School, the excitement he expected didn't come. Instead, a deep sense of dread settled in his stomach, tightening his chest. The massive stone gates loomed ahead, flanked by tall iron columns, and the lush lawns of the school looked more like something from a movie than a place Isaac could ever belong. The sight of neatly manicured lawns, ornate buildings with towering spires, and students dressed in perfect uniforms felt like another world, a world that Isaac wasn't sure he was ready for. The car ride from Jackson had been long, and the entire time Isaac couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to him like a second skin. Clara had been supportive, her usual doubts hidden behind a smile, but Isaac could see the concern in her eyes as they approached the gates of the school. She was just as unsure about this decision as Isaac was, but for the sake of the future she wanted for Isaac, she had given her approval. She had let him go. Now, standing at the threshold of this new world, Isaac felt like an imposter. The first day at Stanton Prep was a blur. Isaac was greeted by a slew of unfamiliar faces, all smiling brightly, dressed in their school uniforms as if they had been wearing them their entire lives. Isaac, however, felt every bit of his difference. The torn sneakers he had worn that morning, the faded jacket he couldn't afford to replace, and the deep sense that he didn't belong. Walking through the corridors, Isaac felt like everyone was watching him. The whispers were quiet, but Isaac could hear the undertones. The new kid, the scholarship kid. It felt as if the entire school had already formed an opinion about him without even knowing his name. Isaac tried to push these thoughts aside as he entered his first class, but when he sat down at the desk, he was keenly aware of the stares. The students around him didn't try to hide their curiosity, and even though they didn't say a word, Isaac could feel the judgment hanging in the air. He sat up straighter, trying to appear confident as he fumbled through his books. In a way, he couldn't blame them. He looked out of place here. It wasn't just the school's wealth or prestige. It was everything. The students had an air of confidence that Isaac lacked. Their polished manners and perfectly pressed clothes made Isaac feel small, insignificant. He wasn't sure how to talk to them, how to fit in. Everything about them screamed privilege, and everything about him screamed otherness. Isaac's first encounter with one of the more influential students came during lunch. Isaac was sitting at a table in the cafeteria trying to blend in and avoid the sharp gazes that followed him. But then, he saw Kyle Benson across the room, sitting with a group of friends laughing loudly. He could feel the weight of Kyle's attention as the bully's eyes landed on him. Kyle stood and walked over to Isaac, his expression smug. Isaac tried to stay calm, hoping that if he ignored him, Kyle would just leave. But that wasn't the case. Well, look who made it to the big leagues," Kyle sneered, his voice carrying across the room. "The charity case." Isaac's stomach tightened, but he didn't look up. Kyle's words were always the same, harsh, cutting, meant to put Isaac in his place. But today, they felt different. Today they felt like an attack on the life Isaac was trying to build here. It wasn't just about school. It was about Isaac's dignity, his identity. You think you belong here, Green? Kyle continued, leaning closer. You're nothing but a charity case, and you'll never fit in with us. Isaac's hands tightened into fists under the table, but he didn't respond. His throat felt tight, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say, but he couldn't find the words. He felt like the walls of the cafeteria were closing in on him. How could he fit in here? How could he prove himself in a world that already saw him as less? Just then, a voice interrupted. Hey, leave him alone. Isaac looked up, surprised to see a boy his age standing by the table, his posture firm and confident. Mason, one of the quieter students Isaac had seen earlier in class, was looking directly at Kyle, his expression unflinching. What's it to you? Kyle spat, glaring at Mason. It's simple, you're a jerk, and you need to leave him alone, Mason said, standing tall with an easy confidence. Kyle sneered, his gaze flicking between Isaac and Mason. But after a tense moment, he turned on his heel and walked back to his friends, muttering under his breath. Isaac's heart raced, but he managed a small smile. Thanks, Isaac said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mason nodded and sat down across from Isaac, offering him a brief smile. No problem. Isaac couldn't believe it. For the first time since he had arrived at Stanton, someone had stood up for him. It felt like a small victory, something he hadn't expected to find in this new world. Mason didn't look like someone who would stand up to Kyle Benson, but in that moment, he did. And somehow, it made Isaac feel like he might just make it here after all. After that incident, Isaac started to feel a little more at ease. Mason and a few other students approached him throughout the day, offering friendly words and gestures that helped Isaac realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. But despite the support, the battle wasn't over. Every day was a new struggle for Isaac. The pressure to succeed was overwhelming. He had never been in an environment like this before. Stanton Prep was a world where success came easily to most, where everything from grades to popularity seemed to be handed out to the right people. Isaac had to work harder just to keep up. He found himself pushing through his classes, trying to focus on the material, but his mind kept wandering. He couldn't stop thinking about home, about Clara, who was still working long hours just to pay the bills, and about Emma, who relied on him to protect her from the realities of their world. Isaac's guilt weighed heavily on him. He was here, trying to make something of himself. But what about the people he had left behind? At night, Isaac would lie in his bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made the right choice. He had traded his old life for this one, and he still wasn't sure if it was worth it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't have a choice. He had to succeed. He had to prove to himself and to his family that he was worth it. And so, Isaac continued to fight. Each new day at Stanton Prep felt like a new battle. But somewhere deep down, he knew that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Isaac had never felt so out of place and so determined at the same time. As the days passed at Stanton Prep, the overwhelming weight of everything started to take its toll. The relentless pressure to prove himself, to be enough for everyone here, felt like a battle he couldn't win. Every morning he walked through the gates, the air thick with the promise of greatness, but fear gnawed at his insides. What was the price of fitting in here? Was it worth the sacrifices he had made just to be a part of this world, a world that wasn't his own? The first few weeks had been filled with the excitement of new opportunities, but now Isaac was realizing that there was a cost to belonging in a place like this. It wasn't just the long hours of studying or the constant pressure to succeed. It was something deeper. The subtle looks, the whispers, the way people sized him up. Isaac felt like an outsider, a stranger in a world that was determined to remind him of his place. Even the students who had shown him kindness, Mason, for example, had their own lives, their own circles. They accepted Isaac, but there was always an unspoken boundary he couldn't cross. Isaac's mind often wandered to his family. He missed his mother, Clara, more than he could put into words. The long-distance calls home were filled with her usual encouragement, but he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. She never asked about the school, not because she didn't care, but because she knew Isaac was doing his best. Still, the guilt weighed heavily on him. Was this life, this opportunity, worth the sacrifices they'd made? Was it worth leaving his family behind? One afternoon, Isaac found himself walking along the football field, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed grass. He wasn't thinking about football or the cheerleaders who laughed and talked under the bleachers. His thoughts were consumed with the uncertainty that seemed to hover around him like a dark cloud. His footsteps slowed as he saw Kyle Benson and a few of his friends lounging near the goalposts, their laughter loud and sharp. Isaac knew what was coming. Kyle had made it clear from day one that he was going to make Isaac's life here miserable. Kyle's words echoed in Isaac's mind like a broken record. "Think you can buy your way into this world, Green?" Kyle's voice carried easily across the field. "They'll never let you in." "Not really. You're just a charity case." Isaac gritted his teeth, his stomach churning. He hated how much those words hurt, even though he'd heard them 1,000 times before. The fact that they were true, or at least felt true, made them harder to ignore. It was as if Kyle had found Isaac's weakness and made it his mission to exploit it. Isaac had learned to keep his head down, to stay out of Kyle's path, to ignore the taunts. But today, something inside him snapped. His fists clenched, and before he realized what he was doing, he was walking straight toward Kyle. "What do you want, Green?" Kyle asked with a sneer, his group of friends falling silent. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Isaac took a deep breath. "I don't have anything to prove to you, Kyle." Kyle laughed, clearly enjoying the discomfort in Isaac's voice. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Before Isaac could walk away, Kyle reached out and shoved him hard. Isaac stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. His heart raced and his mind screamed for him to walk away. But something inside him was different now. He didn't want to be pushed around anymore. Not here, not in this world that had made him feel so small. "Don't touch me!" Isaac's voice was low but firm. Kyle raised an eyebrow, taking a step closer. "What's wrong, Green? Afraid I'll ruin that precious little world you found here?" Isaac took another step forward, his fists trembling at his sides. But before he could say anything else, Mason appeared at his side, standing between him and Kyle. "Kyle, that's enough," Mason said in a calm but commanding voice. The tension in the air was palpable, but Mason didn't back down. He was used to standing his ground. Kyle's face darkened, but he didn't respond. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath as his friends followed. Isaac stood there, his breath shallow, staring at the spot where Kyle had stood just moments before. He felt a rush of relief, but also a gnawing emptiness. Was that what it took to belong here? To fight back, to show that he wasn't afraid, even if it meant becoming part of the same world he was trying to escape? Mason didn't say anything at first. He simply watched Isaac, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Mason finally asked. Isaac nodded, though his mind was still reeling from the confrontation. "Yeah, I'm fine." Mason gave him a small smile. "You've got guts, Green. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Isaac wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that he was strong enough, that he could handle everything this new world threw at him. But the price of belonging to this world felt higher than he had anticipated. There were moments when Isaac felt like he was losing himself, losing the part of him that was real, that was authentic. As he walked away from the field with Mason, Isaac couldn't help but feel like he was carrying two worlds on his shoulders, the world of Stanton Prep and the world he had left behind. He knew he had to make a choice, but it wasn't as simple as picking one or the other. Both worlds were part of him, and the tug of war between them was something he couldn't ignore. That evening, Isaac sat at his desk trying to focus on the homework in front of him. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the same place. The guilt he felt over leaving his mother and sister behind. The pressure to succeed in a world that felt so foreign to him. And the realization that no matter how hard he tried, he would never fully be able to escape the world he came from. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Clara, his mother. "How was your day, Isaac? I miss you." Isaac smiled softly, reading her words. The love in them was unconditional, and for a brief moment, he let himself feel the weight of that love. But then the reality of what he was sacrificing to chase this dream came crashing down on him. He knew there was no turning back now. The battle for belonging was just beginning. Isaac had made it through the first month at Stanton Prep, and each day seemed to bring new challenges. He had learned quickly that fitting in at this school wasn't just about academic excellence. It was about navigating the unspoken rules that governed the social circles, the hierarchy, and the unyielding expectations placed on everyone. The weight of his dual existence, being part of a world he had never known, while holding on to the family and community that shaped him, was growing heavier. Every day felt like a tightrope walk. Isaac wasn't sure which way to lean, but with each passing day, he found a little more strength within himself to keep walking. The pressure to succeed was relentless. The students around him seemed to breeze through life with ease. Their polished performances in every aspect of their world, be it academics, sports, or social events, reminded Isaac of just how far behind he was. But what really gnawed at him was the feeling of never quite belonging. Every smile from a classmate, every polite greeting, felt like it had strings attached. Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that he was always being measured, always a step away from the life that others were born into. But it was a particular afternoon that made Isaac realize something. He couldn't let the weight of the world crush him. He had to rise above it. Isaac was sitting in the library trying to concentrate on a history assignment that seemed like an insurmountable task, when the door to the room opened, and he saw Mason walking toward him. His presence was always a small source of comfort for Isaac, someone who had accepted him without judgment and, more importantly, stood by him when no one else would. "Hey, Isaac, you up for some basketball after school?" Mason asked casually, dropping his bag next to Isaac's desk. Isaac looked up, momentarily surprised by the invitation. He had never thought of himself as athletic, much less someone who could hang out with the popular crowd. Mason had a way of making things feel effortless, like belonging was something that came naturally. "I don't know. I'm kind of buried in work right now," Isaac replied, glancing at the pile of textbooks in front of him. "I've got this essay due tomorrow, and I still haven't finished the chemistry problems." Mason grinned. "You always have an excuse, Green. Don't be a stranger, man. You've got to stop letting this place swallow you up." Isaac hesitated, looking down at his books. The weight of Mason's words hit him harder than he expected. "Stop letting this place swallow you up." That was exactly how he felt. He was drowning in expectations, in doubts, in everything he thought he should be. Maybe Mason was right. Maybe it was time to fight back. "All right, fine. You've convinced me. A quick game wouldn't hurt." Mason nodded, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. "I'll see you after school. Don't make any excuses." As Isaac watched Mason walk out of the library, something clicked inside him. Rising above wasn't just about succeeding academically or getting accepted by others. It was about owning his journey, about fighting against the quiet voice in his head that constantly told him he didn't belong. It was time to stop hiding. Time to stop measuring his worth by the standards of a world that wasn't his. The game of basketball that afternoon wasn't about sports. It was about Isaac finally letting go of the constant pressure he had been under since he stepped through the gates of Stanton Prep. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. For the first time in a long time, he was just living in the moment. As he ran across the court, his legs felt lighter, his heart beating with the rhythm of the game. The sound of sneakers on the hardwood floor, the bouncing of the ball, the laughter of his teammates. It was all so simple, so real. And in that moment, Isaac realized something crucial. He was stronger than he had given himself credit for. The next few weeks were a blur of new experiences, but Isaac's internal shift was undeniable. He started to focus less on fitting in and more on what he wanted out of his life. The world around him was still the same, still full of challenges, judgment, and uncertainty, but Isaac began to see it differently. It wasn't about pretending to be someone he wasn't. It was about embracing who he truly was. Even if he didn't fit the mold of the perfect Stanton Prep student, Isaac found new strength in his family too. The conversations he had with his mother, Clara, no longer felt like they were filled with guilt or regret. Instead, they were about hope, the hope that Isaac was growing, becoming someone who could take on the challenges ahead, someone who would never forget the values he had been raised with. One evening, Isaac was sitting on the porch with Clara, the soft sound of crickets filling the air. Isaac had just finished his homework for the night, and the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. "How's school, Isaac?" Clara asked, looking at him with a mix of love and concern. "It's going okay, Ma." Isaac smiled, not wanting to burden her with the full extent of his struggles. "I'm getting the hang of it. It's not easy, but I'm getting there." Clara nodded, her face softening. "I'm proud of you, Isaac. You've always been strong. I don't doubt for a second that you're going to make it." Isaac felt a lump form in his throat. Clara's faith in him, her unwavering belief that he could do anything, gave him the strength he needed to keep going. It was more than just words. It was the foundation on which he would build the future he wanted. The next morning, as Isaac walked through the school gates, something was different. There was still pressure, still doubt, but Isaac had a newfound confidence. He was rising above the weight of the world that had once felt so suffocating. He was beginning to see that belonging wasn't something that could be earned by appeasing others. It was something that came when he found himself, when he stopped trying to be anyone else. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect. But Isaac knew that he had everything he needed to succeed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. Isaac was no stranger to change. Over the past several weeks at Stanton Prep, he had been thrown into a world far beyond what he could have ever imagined. He was adjusting, growing, learning to find his place among the elite students of the school. But with every step forward, there was always a shadow of doubt, a lingering fear that he might not be strong enough to truly belong. The pressure to change, to be someone he wasn't, had started to feel like more than just a burden. It was becoming a cost. Every day at Stanton Prep demanded a part of him, his confidence, his authenticity, his understanding of who he really was. Isaac had begun to realize that growth came at a price. He was walking the fine line between staying true to himself and adapting to a world that didn't always feel like it accepted him. But in the quiet of the night, when he lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, Isaac couldn't help but wonder if the cost of this change was too high. The following Monday morning, the tension was palpable. Isaac had found a new groove at Stanton. He was no longer the new kid, but someone who had begun to earn the respect of his peers. But that respect came with the weight of expectations. Every conversation felt like a subtle test of his worth. Every interaction seemed like a reminder of how much he had to prove. Isaac had noticed that his peers were starting to treat him differently, not always with the kindness he had initially found. Mason and a few other students had continued to be welcoming, but there were whispers in the hallways, glances when he wasn't looking, and subtle gestures that made him feel like he was still, somehow, on the outside. It was a reminder that true acceptance was rare, and the cost of gaining it was not just about proving he could do well at school. It was about fitting into a world that was unfamiliar to him. And then, the day of the prep school assembly came, and everything seemed to change. Isaac was seated in the front row of the grand auditorium, the school principal speaking about the importance of excellence and standing out among the best. But as Isaac looked around at the polished faces of his peers, he felt a pang of loneliness. No matter how much he had done to fit in, there was always a wall between him and the others. The gap between him and the students around him was widening, and it felt like he was being forced into a mold that wasn't meant for him. At that moment, Isaac's thoughts went back to Mason, to the small group of students who had offered him friendship without expectation. The difference was clear. They saw Isaac for who he truly was, while the rest of the school only saw what they wanted him to be. As he sat there quietly listening to the principal's speech about future opportunities, the cost of change became all too clear. Isaac was beginning to lose himself in his pursuit of belonging. He wasn't just navigating a new school anymore. He was navigating the complexities of his own identity. Later that afternoon, as Isaac sat in the student lounge, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay?" Mason asked, sitting down beside him. Isaac forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired." Mason raised an eyebrow, studying Isaac carefully. "You've been a little off lately. Is everything all right?" Isaac hesitated. He had been bottling up his frustrations for weeks, trying to ignore the constant pressure that came with being here. But Mason was different. Mason actually cared. "I don't know, Mason," Isaac finally admitted, his voice low. "I'm starting to wonder if I belong here. The whole thing feels like a game I don't know how to play." Mason nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. This place, it's a lot. People expect you to be perfect, to fit into a certain mold. But listen, Isaac, no matter how much you change, no matter how hard you try, you'll never make them happy if you don't stay true to yourself." Isaac let out a slow breath. It was the advice he needed to hear, but part of him wasn't sure if he could follow it. Was he really ready to let go of the dream of fitting in? Was it possible to succeed in a world like this without losing the part of him that had always kept him grounded? As the days went on, the cost of change began to weigh on Isaac more heavily. The small victories, passing exams, making friends, felt insignificant compared to the internal battle he was waging. The expectations of Stanton Prep weren't just academic, they were cultural, social, and emotional. Isaac started to wonder if it was all worth it. Every time he felt like he was making progress, something came up to remind him how different he was. Whether it was a remark from one of the more popular students or the constant comparison to others, Isaac was constantly reminded that the cost of change wasn't just about changing who he was. It was about giving up parts of himself to fit into a world that didn't always feel like it was meant for him. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Isaac received a call from home. Clara's voice was soft on the other end, but he could hear the exhaustion in her tone. "Isaac, I know it's hard, but I'm so proud of you," Clara said. "I know you're doing your best. Just remember, this is your journey, not anyone else's. Don't let the weight of this place make you forget who you are." Her words hit Isaac like a wave, crashing over him with the power of everything he had been holding back. He was so afraid of failing her, of not living up to the expectations that had been placed on him. But Clara's voice reminded him of something essential, that no matter how far he went, no matter what changes he faced, he still had a home, a family who would support him no matter what. As Isaac hung up the phone, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. The cost of change was steep, but it didn't have to destroy him. He could rise above the pressure, the expectations, and still hold on to who he was. He didn't need to fit in perfectly. He just needed to find his place in a way that was true to him. Isaac knew it wouldn't be easy. The battle was far from over. But for the first time since he arrived at Stanton, Isaac felt like he could face the challenges ahead, not by changing to fit in, but by staying true to who he was and knowing that, in the end, that would be enough. Isaac had spent weeks battling the storm of doubt and pressure that came with trying to belong at Stanton Prep. There were moments when he felt like he was on the verge of losing himself completely, drowning in a world that seemed so foreign, so far removed from the life he had once known. But lately, something had shifted within him. It wasn't a drastic change, but the more Isaac embraced who he truly was, the more he refused to conform to the expectations others had set for him. The more he started to feel a sense of peace. It was the smallest things that helped Isaac see the light at the end of the tunnel. The quiet moments in the school courtyard where he could finally relax without feeling like everyone was watching him. The laughter he shared with Mason and a few other friends who had come to understand him. And the late-night conversations with Clara that reminded him of the strength he had back home. Slowly, Isaac was realizing that he didn't need to fit into the mold of perfection to succeed. His success wasn't determined by what others saw in him. It was about what he saw in himself. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, Isaac felt like he could weather it. It was a crisp, sunny day when Isaac found himself walking to the school cafeteria, deep in thought about his upcoming exams. He had come a long way, but he still had a lot of work ahead of him. Despite everything, the weight of Stanton Prep's expectations continued to press on him. Isaac wasn't naive enough to think he had overcome every obstacle. There were still many challenges ahead. But there was a new clarity in his mind, a sense that he wasn't fighting alone. As Isaac walked into the cafeteria, he noticed Kyle Benson standing near the food counter, chatting with some of his friends. It had been weeks since Kyle had taunted him, but Isaac still carried the sting of those early days. The encounter with Kyle, the insults, the bullying, it had all felt like a constant reminder of how out of place Isaac was. Isaac's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Hey, Isaac, you're looking better these days." Isaac turned to see Mason standing behind him, a half smile on his face. Mason's presence was a constant reassurance for Isaac, someone who had always seen him, not as the outsider, but as a person who was capable of so much more than he gave himself credit for. "Thanks, Mason. I guess I'm getting the hang of it." Isaac smiled, the tension in his chest easing. "You sure about that?" Mason's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I think you've been hiding your true self for too long. You've got what it takes to really make an impact here. Don't sell yourself short." Isaac felt a swell of warmth in his chest. There was something about Mason's words that resonated deeply with him. For the first time, Isaac felt like he could stand tall in this world without needing to prove anything. Mason's words weren't just a compliment. They were a reminder that Isaac's journey wasn't about meeting everyone else's expectations. It was about being authentic. But just as Isaac was about to respond, the unexpected happened. Kyle and his friends glanced over at them, a sneer crossing Kyle's face. Isaac could feel the old tension rising again, the familiar feeling of being judged. "What's this, Green? Making friends with the rejects now?" Kyle's voice was dripping with sarcasm, his eyes narrowing. Isaac felt his stomach churn, but this time, something inside him shifted. He didn't feel the rush of anger or insecurity he used to. Instead, there was just a sense of clarity. Kyle's words were loud, but they didn't hold the same power over Isaac anymore. He wasn't going to let them define him. Not now. Not ever again. "Kyle, I don't have time for your nonsense," Isaac said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not interested in your games. You do you, and I'll do me." Kyle blinked, clearly taken aback by Isaac's response. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, but Kyle seemed to realize that Isaac wasn't going to be an easy target anymore. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving Isaac and Mason standing together in the middle of the cafeteria. Mason grinned, his eyes filled with pride. Well, that was satisfying to watch. Isaac smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had just stood up for himself in a way he never thought he could. He didn't need to fight back with fists or words. His confidence, his authenticity was his greatest weapon. As the days passed, Isaac continued to grow both academically and emotionally. The pressure of Stanton Prep was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Isaac had found his rhythm. He worked hard in his classes, but he also made time for the things that mattered to him. He spent more time with his friends, and he allowed himself to dream about what the future could hold. It wasn't just about fitting in anymore. It was about building a life that felt true to him. One evening, after a long day of exams and study sessions, Isaac sat down on the steps outside the school dormitory. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the campus. Isaac looked around at the familiar surroundings, the towering buildings, the manicured lawns, and realized that this place, which had once seemed so alien to him, was starting to feel like home. He thought about his family back home, about Clara and Emma, and the love they had given him. He thought about how far he had come. There were still obstacles ahead, and the journey wasn't over, but Isaac felt like he could face whatever came next. He wasn't going to let the world change him anymore. He was going to change it, one step at a time. The next day, as Isaac walked through the hallways of Stanton Prep, he didn't feel the weight of the world pressing on him anymore. He wasn't afraid to be himself. He wasn't afraid of the future. With every step, Isaac felt a little more in control of his destiny. There was light at the end of the tunnel, and he was ready to walk toward it. Isaac stood in front of the dormitory window, gazing out at the campus. It was the first day of spring, and the world outside seemed to echo his sense of rebirth. The cold grip of self-doubt that had once consumed him had loosened, replaced by a growing sense of confidence. For the first time since arriving at Stanton Prep, Isaac felt ready for the challenges ahead. He had learned that belonging wasn't about changing who he was to fit in. It was about embracing his true self and finding his place in a world that was ever-changing. His thoughts drifted back to the countless moments of self-reflection over the past few months. Times when he had questioned whether he was strong enough to endure the weight of his decisions. But every test, every obstacle, had shaped him into someone unrecognizable from the young boy who had first stepped into this school, full of uncertainty. Isaac had come to realize that the greatest change he had undergone wasn't external, it was internal. He wasn't just adjusting to this world, he was embracing it on his own terms. It had been months since that first confrontation with Kyle, and Isaac's confidence had grown exponentially. He had begun to excel in his classes, earning recognition from his teachers. But the real victory was in his ability to look at himself in the mirror and finally feel proud of the person he was becoming. The relationship with his family had evolved too. Clara's phone calls were filled with a renewed sense of hope. Isaac had stopped seeing them as a source of guilt. His mother's voice, once filled with worry, now carried a sense of pride. Isaac wasn't just succeeding for himself, he was succeeding for the people who had believed in him from the beginning. But even as Isaac moved forward, he understood that there were still hurdles to overcome. The pressure of maintaining his place at Stanton Prep was still there, and Kyle, despite being less vocal, still loomed as a reminder of the barriers Isaac had yet to break down. Isaac had learned, however, that those external forces no longer held the power they once did. They could only affect him if he let them. One morning, Isaac entered the school cafeteria, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. The familiar clatter of trays and laughter filled the room, but instead of feeling small in the midst of it all, Isaac felt like he belonged. Mason waved him over, and Isaac smiled, taking a seat beside him. "Hey, man, good to see you." Mason grinned, clearly in a good mood. "You ready for the big presentation?" Isaac nodded. "Yeah, I think I'm ready. It's been a lot of work, but I think it's going to go well." Mason leaned in, his voice lower now. "You've come a long way, Isaac. Just remember, don't overthink it. This is your moment." Isaac took a deep breath. Mason's words echoed in his mind. This is your moment. Isaac realized it wasn't just about the presentation. It wasn't about pleasing anyone or meeting anyone's expectations. It was about stepping forward with the confidence that he was capable of anything, because he believed it. "Thanks, Mason. I needed to hear that." Later that afternoon, Isaac stood in front of his class, his presentation materials laid out in front of him. The faces of his classmates were focused, but instead of feeling the familiar flutter of nerves, Isaac felt an odd sense of calm. This wasn't just about impressing anyone. This was about sharing his work, his passion for what he had learned. The speech flowed smoothly, his voice steady, every word reflecting the growth he had experienced. As he spoke, Isaac felt as if he was speaking not only to his classmates, but to the person he had once been, unsure, insecure, and searching for validation. By the time he finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It wasn't just a polite gesture, it was genuine. Isaac smiled, but deep down he knew the applause didn't matter as much as what he felt inside. He had made it, and he had made it his way. After the class ended, Mason came up to him, his face filled with pride. "You nailed it, Isaac." Mason clapped him on the back. "That's the Isaac I've been seeing all along." Isaac felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The recognition felt good, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the fact that he had stayed true to who he was, that he had risen above the challenges and come out stronger for it. As Isaac walked out of the classroom, he saw Kyle across the hall, standing with a few friends. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Kyle's expression was as cold as ever, but Isaac didn't feel anger, frustration, or even fear. He simply nodded as if acknowledging the person Kyle was. someone who would always try to put others down to feel superior. But Isaac didn't need Kyle's approval anymore. He had found himself, and in doing so, he had found his place. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Isaac walked through the halls of Stanton Prep with his head held higher than before. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't flawless. But for the first time, Isaac didn't feel like he had to be. His authenticity was enough. His journey had only just begun, and the future, while uncertain, was something Isaac knew he could face head-on. Later that evening, as Isaac sat on the porch of the dormitory staring at the setting sun, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The challenges, the changes, the difficult moments, they were all part of his story. And he had learned that no matter where he went, no matter what happened next, he would always be enough. Isaac was no longer afraid of the future. He was ready to meet it.